was known to have these temper tantrums fairly often, and no amount of comforting words or affectionate embraces seemed capable of calming him. Instead, every attempt to soothe him only appeared to fuel his rage further. As his cries echoed through the house, Shanti couldn't help worrying that all the neighbours could hear his screams, and more than anything she felt helpless. This wasn't the sort of tantrum that parents normally dealt with when raising toddlers. Titu wasn't upset over a toy, an argument with his siblings, or because he had been refused something that he wanted. The most troubling aspect was that neither Shanti nor her husband understood what triggered these episodes. They erupted without warning, and ended only when Titu himself seemed ready for them to stop. They became deeply concerned, and his parents had already sought medical advice for his outbursts. A local doctor examined Titu thoroughly, but found no evidence of any physical illness. If something was causing such extreme distress, the doctor believed the explanation was likely psychological rather than medical. Still hoping to comfort her son, Shanti hugged him tightly and kissed him on the forehead, but instead of responding with affection, Titu lashed out violently. He kicked, punched, and struck at her face until she lost her balance and fell backwards onto the bed. Moments later, he jumped down and raced out of the room. Before the last outburst had begun, Shanti had asked her husband and the other children to remain outside until things settled down. For a brief moment, she considered staying where she was and allowing Titu to exhaust himself. But then came a sharp crash that shattered the silence. The unmistakable sound of a plate breaking came from the kitchen. Hurrying towards the noise, Shanti found Titu standing over the shattered pieces scattered across the kitchen floor, and there was little doubt that he had smashed the plate intentionally. Although anger welled up inside Shanti, she knew that losing her temper would only make matters worse. At times like these, the only practical solution was to keep Titu somewhere he couldn't harm himself, injure anyone else, or continue destroying the house. So keeping her voice as steady as she could despite all of the chaos, Shanti cautiously approached Titu whilst he continued kicking and swinging his arms. She gently turned him so he couldn't hit her, lifted him into her arms, carried him into his bedroom, and closed the door behind him. Then she lowered herself on the floor outside, bracing her back firmly against the door to stop him from forcing it open. On the other side, Titu was hurling himself against the door, pushing, pounding, and throwing his full weight against it, while Shanti silently hoped the episode was finally coming to an end. After several minutes, she heard something she had come to recognize. Whenever one of Titu's violent episodes began to fade, he always repeated exactly the same unusual words. As the pounding slowed, she heard him chanting over and over what sounded like Shush Verma, Shush Verma, Shush Verma. Neither Shanti nor anyone else in the house had the slightest idea what that meant. They assumed it was nothing more than meaningless nonsense coming from impossible to comfort no matter what his parents tried to do. Initially, Shanti and her husband assumed they simply had an unusually demanding baby, but as he grew into a toddler, it became increasingly obvious that something about him was different. He rarely seemed content. Instead, he always appeared to be on the verge of crying, becoming angry, or exploding into another emotional outburst. Their greatest concern arose after he began talking at around the age of 2. It wasn't only that he repeated the same Shashverma phrase, but the things he talked about seemed entirely unlike anything people would expect to hear from such a young child. Although Shanti's family weren't wealthy, they lived comfortably within their modest means. Their small concrete home provided everything they truly needed. They owned neither a television nor a car, and many of the children's clothes had been handed down from their older siblings. Shanti even made much of the family's clothing herself. But even so, they never went hungry. They placed great importance on education and enjoyed a stable, loving family life. And Titu had never experienced anything different. And yet, as soon as he was able to speak, he began criticizing nearly everything around him. Whenever Shanti wore one of her older saris that had been patched or repaired, Titu bluntly remarked that she looked as though she were wearing rags. As he wandered through the house, he would point out dusty corners or untidy areas, insisting that they be cleaned because he refused to live in such surroundings. Whenever the family travelled somewhere on foot or by bus, he complained repeatedly that they ought to be driving a car instead. What made the behaviour especially strange was that he spoke as though travelling by car was completely normal, despite having almost no personal experience with cars. Equally puzzling was his fixation on the nearby city of Agra. Only a short distance from their village, Agra was well known for attractions such as the Taj Mahal and its busy commercial-filled streets with visitors and shops. Although it was close by, Titu had never been there, and none of the family had any particular connection to the city. Nevertheless, from the age of 2, he constantly begged his parents to take him there, often making the request several times a week. Whenever they refused, he would have another explosive tantrum. At first, Shanti and her husband convinced themselves that it was merely a stage that would eventually pass, but instead the behaviour became increasingly alarming. Not long afterwards, Titu attacked another child with a length of sugarcane, beating the youngster so badly that he was left bruised and bleeding. On another occasion, Shanti took Titu with her to a local shop. Whilst browsing, she paused to admire a bracelet displayed behind the counter, fully aware that she couldn't afford it. And somehow noticing her interest, Titu calmly turned to the shopkeeper and declared that unless he gave the bracelet to his mother free of charge, he would shoot him and kill him. That threat horrified Shanti. From that point onward, she and her husband avoided taking Titu into public unless absolutely necessary. His behaviour had become too unpredictable, and the embarrassment was becoming impossible to bear. Yet, despite everything else, Shanti found herself returning again and again to the same unanswered question. Who or what was Shashverma? She had no idea. Several months after the incident involving the broken plate, in April 1987, the mystery surrounding Titu seemed to reach a turning point. The day began no differently from countless others. Shanti prepared breakfast while her husband left home to run several errands. Around the house and in the yard, their 6 children occupied themselves with games, schoolwork, After some time, Shanti's eldest son walked into the room and casually asked, "When do you think father will return from Agra?" The moment Titu heard the name of the city, his entire demeanour changed. He immediately looked up, giving the conversation his full attention, as Shanti and her eldest son continued discussing his father's trip. Titu silently got to his feet and slipped out of the room. A short time later, he reappeared carrying a small bundle of clothes tucked under one arm. And without saying a word, he walked straight past his mother and brother, stepped through the front door, and suddenly broke into a run down the road. And he was only 3 years old. For several seconds, Shanti and her eldest son simply stared after him, too stunned to react, but then instinct took over. Her eldest son sprinted after the determined Titu. Although catching him didn't take long, bringing him back proved far more difficult. He resisted every step of the way, struggling furiously as his brother attempted to carry him home. By the time they reached the house, Shanti immediately noticed the damage. A dark bruise was already beginning to show around her eldest son's eye. During the struggle, Titu had struck him with enough force to leave him with a black eye. When Shanti tried to persuade Titu to apologize, she quickly realized it was hopeless. Another violent outburst erupted. He collapsed onto the floor, screaming uncontrollably whilst rolling from side to side, kicking wildly and thrashing his arms out in every direction. Having learned through experience that reasoning with him was impossible once a tantrum reached this stage, Shanti and her eldest son did the only thing they could. As gently as possible, they restrained him to prevent him from injuring himself or anyone nearby. And eventually the storm began to subside. As always, Titu started repeating the familiar phrase, "Shush Verma, shush Verma." But this time, there was something new. Between repetitions of this phrase, he cried out about a radio shop in Agra. Again and again he shouted, "Why didn't father take me to the radio shop? Why didn't he take me there?" Shanti immediately recognized that this was different. Unlike the mysterious phrase he always repeated, a radio shop was something tangible. It was a real place, one that might actually exist. When the tantrum had finally passed and Titu wandered away, Shanti turned to her eldest son with a determined expression. "I want you to go to Agra," she told him. "Find a radio shop. See if you can discover anything that explains why your brother keeps talking about that city." She admitted she had no idea whether the search would lead anywhere, but after years of unanswered questions, she felt she had nothing left to lose. Borrowing a friend's car, her eldest son drove into Agra accompanied by his friend, determined to investigate. He was gone for several hours, and when he finally returned home, Shanti noticed immediately that something had changed. His expression was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Even before he spoke, she sensed that he had uncovered something important. "What happened?" she asked anxiously. "Did you find anything?" He remained silent for several moments before quietly answering, "We're going to have visitors tomorrow." The following day, a car pulled up outside Shanti's home and 6 people stepped out. Among them was a woman in her 30s dressed in an elegant red sari. Accompanying her were 3 well-dressed men of a similar age, each wearing smart jackets and suits. An elderly couple completed the group. The older gentleman wore a neatly presented sweater, while the elderly woman was dressed in fine silk clothing. Everything about the visitors suggested wealth and refinement. Their appearance stood in marked contrast to the simple lifestyle of Shanti's family. Inside the house, Shanti heard a sound she had never heard from her son before. It wasn't laughter. It wasn't overexcitement. It was overwhelming happiness. For what may have been the first time in his short life, Titu sounded completely joyful. Hearing that single cry filled Shanti's eyes with tears. Before anyone had introduced themselves or exchanged a single word, she somehow felt certain that the mystery surrounding her son was finally beginning to reveal itself. Moments later, Titu called excitedly toward the house. "Come outside," he shouted. "I want you to meet my other family." Shanti welcomed the visitors inside and guided everyone to the back veranda where they gathered around a table. And an awkward silence settled over the group. No one offered introductions, no names were exchanged. Everyone simply waited to see what would happen next. Throughout the silence, Titu's attention remained fixed on the woman dressed in the red sari. He couldn't stop smiling at her. Finally, Titu broke the silence. He politely asked if she would come and sit next to him. After only a brief hesitation, she moved her chair next to his. Looking up at her with a warm smile, Titu said, "Do you know who I am?" The woman gently shook her head. "No, I don't." Still smiling, Titu answered, "I know who you are. You're Uma." The woman's eyes widened immediately. Her name was indeed Uma, and no one in Shanti's family had ever met her before. Before she could even ask how Titu knew her name, he continued, "Do you remember when we went to the fair with Ranu and Sanjay? I bought sweets for you." Uma's expression transformed. At first she had simply appeared astonished that an unfamiliar child knew her name, but now something else appeared on her face. Recognition. Watching the exchange unfold, Shanti suddenly acted on a thought that had just occurred to her. Without saying a word, she hurried into the house, and a few moments later she returned carrying a pair of scissors. The other adults looked on in confusion as she walked directly towards Titu. Gently, she tilted his head to one side, exposing his right ear, and carefully trimmed away some hair covering the side of his head. As more hair fell away, revealing the skin around his ear, audible gasps spread across the veranda. But Titu simply continued smiling. The others, however, stared in disbelief. To understand why everyone reacted with such shock, it's necessary to return to what Shanti's eldest son had discovered during his search in Agra. After arriving in the city the previous day, he and his friends spent hours driving through its streets, searching for any radio shop that might somehow relate to the strange statements that Titu had been making. Initially, they found nothing. They visited one location after another without uncovering anything that seemed remotely connected. Then they noticed a particular shop. Its sign immediately caught the older brother's attention. It read, "Suresh Radio Shop." Recognizing the similarity between the shop's name, Suresh, and the words Titu repeated during every tantrum, Shash, the two young men parked their car and went inside. There they met the owner. She was a woman in her 30s, wearing a red sari, and her name was Uma. When Shanti's eldest son asked why the business was called Suresh Radio Shop, Uma explained its tragic history. The shop had originally belonged to her husband. 3.5 years earlier, he had been murdered after being shot in the head. After his death, Uma had taken over the business herself. She considered changing its name, but ultimately decided to leave it unchanged because it had always carried her phrase repeated at the end of every tantrum had not been a meaningless phrase. It was a name, Suresh Verma, and it belonged to a real person. That discovery convinced Uma and several members of Suresh Verma's family to accompany him back to Shanti's village the following day. Now seated all together on the veranda, Shanti herself was beginning to piece everything together. There was one final detail that Uma had shared with her eldest son that Shanti found impossible to ignore. Suresh Verma had not simply been shot. The bullet had entered the right side of his head just above his ear before exiting directly beneath it. The instant Shanti heard that description, she thought of something she had noticed every day since Titu's birth. Her son had two unusually distinct birthmarks surrounding his right ear. One lay just above it, and the other sat directly below it. That memory was the reason she had rushed to get the scissors. As she carefully trimmed away the hair concealing the side of Titu's head, everyone present could clearly see the two marks, and silence settled over the veranda. The birthmarks appeared in almost precisely the same locations where the fatal bullet had entered and exited Suresh Verma's head. No one spoke. They simply stared at what was before them. There was another coincidence that made this story even more difficult to dismiss. The day Suresh Verma lost his life was the very same day Shanti, whilst pregnant with Titu, suddenly became gravely ill. Her condition worsened so rapidly that doctors admitted her to hospital, where she remained for the final months of her pregnancy until Titu was born. As news of Titu's extraordinary story spread, it attracted attention far beyond his small village. Doctors, psychologists, university professors, and researchers from across India, as well as from overseas, travelled to meet the family and investigate the claims for themselves. Among the explanations they considered was one that has existed in many cultures for centuries: reincarnation. According to that theory, the consciousness or spirit of Suresh Verma left his body at the moment of his death and somehow entered the unborn child who would later be born as Titu. If this were true, it would account for a lot of details that had puzzled Shanti and her family for years. The phrase Suresh Verma that Titu repeated during almost every tantrum would no longer be an unexplained phrase, but the identity of a person that actually once lived. His persistent longing to visit Agra would also make perfect sense, since that's where Suresh lived and worked. Likewise, his repeated demands to be taken to a radio shop suddenly became understandable. According to this story, he wasn't referring to an unfamiliar business. He was asking to return to the shop that he had once owned himself. Even Titu's constant dissatisfaction with his family's modest lifestyle appeared easier to explain through the lens of reincarnation. Shanti and her husband lived simple but comfortable lives. Although they lacked many luxuries, they always had enough to eat, valued education, and provided a loving home for their children. Suresh Verma, by contrast, had belonged to a prosperous household and enjoyed a considerably higher standard of living. If fragments of those earlier memories had somehow remained, they might explain why Titu complained about patched clothing, travelling by bus instead of by car, or the condition of the family home, despite having known nothing else his entire life. For many investigators, however, perhaps the most compelling aspect of Titu's story wasn't his statements or his apparent recognitions, it was the birthmarks. Researchers who have studied reports of alleged reincarnation have occasionally documented Perhaps those fears seemed justified. Titu expressed a desire to remain with the people he had believed he had known in his previous life. Over time, however, those feelings gradually softened. As he continued spending time with both families, he eventually chose to stay with his new parents who had raised him since birth, whilst maintaining regular contact with Uma and his other relatives. The arrangement proved surprisingly successful. Rather than drifting apart, the two families developed a close relationship, visiting one another frequently and remaining on warm terms for many years. Perhaps the greatest transformation, however, occurred within Titu himself. The violent tantrums that had once dominated his childhood slowly faded away and his anger gradually disappeared. The aggressive behaviour that had caused his parents so much fear and distress eventually came to an end. Instead of growing into the uncontrollable child that everyone feared he might become, Titu matured into an ordinary, well-adjusted adult. As the years passed, he built a successful life for himself. He got married, raised a family of his own, and eventually became a professor at a college in India. Even decades later, his story continues to rank among the most widely discussed and thoroughly investigated cases associated with alleged reincarnation. Whatever conclusion people ultimately draw, the story of Titu Singh continues to provoke debate among psychologists, researchers, historians of religion, and believers alike. The little boy whose behaviour once left his family frightened and bewildered became the centre of an enduring mystery, one that decades later still challenges assumptions and continues to inspire discussion around the world as to